of email, granted. And then we assigned about 3 cases to each attorney, and we meet each week to sort of go over the cases, talk through issues, analyze transcripts, and just sort of check in. And it's been a really great experience. I've been able to work on my public speaking skills, my project management skills, and I've been able to network with these partners. In my actual practice, I've not been able to work with these partners on client work. So through this project, I've been able to actually get to know these partners through this work, and I've been able to leverage that into client work after this project and continue those relationships. And so that's been great. And also, this work is great for more junior associates to sort of take ownership of a case and really see things through. And in those weekly check-ins, I'm sort of the person that's talking the most and providing more of the updates and sort of taking control of things. And that's kind of really nice at this point in my career. And so I would say everyone really enjoys working on these cases as a group. And it's been really positive for me as a second year at this point at a bigger law firm to sort of take on these cases, get to know these client stories, but also as on a career development front, improve on all those aspects. And so I hope that anyone else that's in a bigger law firm setting that's here listening can also benefit from that if they choose to move forward with this project. And with that said, I'd like to pass it off to Nick.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Synthopoulos, staff attorney at the Center for Taxpayer Rights. And almost exactly a year ago, I was actually attending part 1 of this. And then I took a case as a volunteer and have been very impressed with just how interesting this stuff is and the big difference it can make. So if we could start, please, here with sharing slide 3. I'll cover slides 3 through 15, and that's sort of 2 steps in this process. The first step is opening a case, and the next one is securing IRS records. So slide 3 here just shows each of these subtopics within step 1. So we've got things like intake questionnaire, IRS form 2848, and a variety of other issues. Each one of these takes up at least 1 slide on its own. Next slide, please, to number 4 here. This starts with the intake questionnaire, which if you go to this website here, litcsupportcenter.org, you can register to look for a sample here. And it's a really good starting point to get facts that you might need. You can tailor this to however you'd like to approach your taxpayer. In the middle here, we have representation agreement. So that establishes the rules of the road. And it's got another sample here online that you can use. And so this can be really helpful also for the taxpayer. They have something to refer to if they have any questions about what might be going on. It can also be good to outline sort of the representation scope. Is it going to be just the IRS federal issue? Might there be something involving a state revenue authority or something else? The third point here on this slide is Form 2848, Power of Attorney and Declaration of Representative. This is important to really pre-fill as much of this form as possible. It's only 2 pages, but there are a lot of little fields. So making sure that it's as simple as possible for the taxpayer to sign in the right area and date in the right area before sending it back. This also has a Spanish version available. If your taxpayer reads Spanish, that's the Form 2848, parentheses, SP, close parentheses. And on the first page of this, in the matter descriptions, it's good to include income, maybe separate assessment. This is just a list of different things you can put in there. There are 3 boxes for those on the form. So next to slide 5. This starts off with the form FS13. This is the authorization for release of information. It's for the Bureau of Fiscal Service, which is a part of the Treasury. they're the ones who actually print and mail the checks. So if it's a paper check as opposed to direct deposit, that can be really helpful. And so this lets the person who's being authorized do a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, and that can be good for getting, for example, copies of the check that was sent, information about whether it's been deposited, if so, when and where. And the form mentions it's generally valid for 6 months from the date of signing. The other item on this slide is the third-party contact authorization form. Navigating prison obstacles can be challenging, so if there's a trusted third party, this can be a good sample format to use. It's a good idea to consider talking with your client, though, about possible risks of waiving client-attorney privilege. Some may have not really thought of that issue before, and so it's good to bring that up maybe. Next slide, please, is
before the next slide, Nick, I just want to jump in with the third party contact authorization. Where I found this helpful too is if the inmate has been released and we don't have updated contact information for them and they didn't leave any forwarding information at the facility, we've had luck in some cases reaching out to the third party contact to then get updated contact information for the inmate. So I think it can be really helpful for that purpose as well.
Yes, thank you. And my experience has only been with the Virginia Department of Corrections, so experiences with other entities might be different, but with them at least, one of the issues too is sometimes they will transfer an inmate more than once without giving notice. And so, yeah, another great reason to possibly have that. Next here on slide 6, multi-jurisdictional practice disclaimer, if applicable. So for me, for instance, I'm licensed in North Carolina and Minnesota, but my taxpayer was located in Virginia. So I wanted to be kind of careful about any risk of someone thinking, oh, well, this person is acting as though they are a Virginia licensed attorney. And these bullet points kind of cover the pros and cons of kind of thinking about which approach is better, because, are you an attorney? Yes or no is just way simpler than the more detailed explanation of where and in which courts, if that's applicable. Next slide. This is slide 7, talking about legal correspondence. And it gives a citation here to a good starting point in research, a US Supreme Court case that held that prison officials must open an inmate's legal mail in the inmate's presence. So the second bullet point here, the first one talks about things that you can put on the envelope, maybe both sides, to help ensure that the prison understands there's a client-attorney relationship here and that they shouldn't just be reading it. In fact, they should just be opening it in the inmate's presence. The more the merrier, I figure. I don't usually say, hey, Nixon Thoplos, Esquire, attorney at law, but for this purpose, may as well throw it all on there. Next slide. This is number 8. And so want to make sure that it's sent to the correct address. If it's a Virginia State prison, they have a centralized mail distribution center. Another item to include on the envelope is your phone number, because they tend to want to call the attorney or purported attorney to authenticate identity. This is where I first thought about doing some of the research on client correspondence when it's an inmate, because despite my phone number not being on the envelope, they somehow were able to find my phone number, which was in the envelope. So this is just kind of predicting issues that there might be and trying to minimize them. So they'll tend to call, so it's important to return their call or voicemail as soon as possible to authenticate. Next slide. This is number 9.
I'll just highlight here on slide 8, Nick, that as you mentioned, Virginia has its own centralized mail distribution center, and we've mostly been working, all of the panelists on the panel today, with Virginia Department of Corrections. So we're used to dealing with the centralized mailing center. Your state may have a different process. So it's really important to figure out what type of facility the inmate's located in and if they have a special mail center or you're supposed to be mailing it to the physical address. Because specifically in Virginia, if it's legal mail, it's supposed to go to the centralized mail distribution center. And while I'm speaking, I think I'll just mention there was a question in the chat about the types of issues that we'd be seeing in these cases. And the goal of these cases at this point in time is to help inmates obtain their stimulus payments. So a lot of them, the payments might have been issued, but they didn't receive them. The payments might not have ever been issued. They could have been victims of identity theft. So we do get into these issues in more detail in just a bit, but just wanted to give you a heads up. That's generally what we're dealing with in these cases are these stimulus related issues, but that can lead to needs for payment trace requests, for identity theft, for identity verification. Those are the main issues you're going to be seeing in these cases. All right, Nick, I'll move us along to slide 9.
Thank you. And yeah, just to add with that also, at least Virginia Department of Corrections, their website's been a good resource to find operation manuals and other things. And so other states, the federal system may have similar information out there. So this slide talks about inmate phone calls. And for Virginia state cases, my experience has been that calls are incoming to the attorney. Not going to have good luck trying to contact the inmate directly. So Virginia also has a do not record listing. So it's good to request that you're added to that. And if you're in a state that doesn't have that, it'd be good to consider pushing them on why they don't. Virginia may also use this legal visit request form to schedule phone calls. I first saw that when I visited an inmate in person, which I'll cover in another slide here. But in that experience, the call was limited to 20 minutes, but once it ended, the inmate was able to call me right back to continue the conversation. Not guaranteed that that'll happen in every situation, but it's at least a possibility. And so next slide, please.
And I don't know, Nick, if you or Diggy have had this situation, but we've had some taxpayers that have called us, I think using their phone call, called maybe a family member or a friend who then conferenced us in, but didn't tell us that that's what was happening. So I think there's also some confidentiality concerns there where you want to make sure that you're aware who is actually on the call and that, you know, if you're working with your client, that they understand, you know, the potential ramifications of having someone else on this call, and that if it's not an official legal call, that it could be recorded. I don't know if you have anything to add, Diggy.
Yes, that's happened to me several times. A lot of inmates depend on their parents or fiancés or friends. We've had to explain that issue with them.
Okay, great. So moving on to slide 10.
So thank you for bringing that up, because it does make me think too of a situation where I had a call coming in and it was some kind of counselor that the inmate was working with. And so similar sort of, issue there. And I'll say too that these cases, if you have phone numbers that are being used to receive calls, that saving it as an entry so that you know it's an inmate, and maybe being even more flexible in when you do take calls, because it can be kind of, not nearly as common that you can just schedule a call sort of thing. Let's see. So slide 10 here, inmate in-person visit. I'll say feasible visiting an inmate in person can be a game changer. I know it was in the case that I was involved in. Using postal service to send back and forth multiple page documents can get kind of difficult, can get kind of overwhelming, especially depending on, like anyone, the inmate may not have gotten in school long enough in formal education to be extremely able to read these sometimes very technical difficulties. And I'll say my experience that visiting this prison it way more isolating than visiting a jail. It might be in the middle of an area where people otherwise, just more isolating, and that can only help with empathy, kind of getting a glance at that perspective and what they're dealing with. So for Virginia State, that would require a legal visit request form. I've requested to bring a laptop in. They've denied it each time, so that's a heads up. Similarly, if I bring papers to it, they don't let me leave the papers with my client. I have to then mail them to the client. So that may vary depending on which entity you're dealing with. You might want to check their process. I'll say, too, that I've done a couple of in-person visits, and for one, there was maybe a newer employee there who wanted to be in the same room. It was a large room, but in the same one for security purposes. But someone else was able to explain to them, client attorney privilege, you should be on the other side of the door or somewhere that you're not potentially overhearing these conversations. So next slide, please. This is number 12. We're in step 2 now, securing IRS records. Most of these will be transcripts, IRS transcripts. It also will talk a bit about FOIA. So this starts with IRS account transcripts. These are great to look at account history. There's a lot of information there. There are some items that it doesn't include. For example, it might not show a return having been filed if the return was flagged for possible identity theft. For example, the Taxpayer Protection Program, TPP. I will note also that account transcripts are great as evidence, but they are just one brick in that wall. So, for example, earlier this week, on Monday, October 21, 2024, there was a tech issue so that for some individuals, it had shown a tax return as being filed. Now it showed as not filed. I've heard that account transcript issue has been systemically resolved, but just a reminder that evidence can change, and it's just one example of evidence. My own approach tends to be, if I pull an account transcript, save it until it becomes irrelevant. That way you have multiple screenshots, and if there's a tech issue that's emerged, you have good evidence that, hey, this return was filed, what's going on. Next slide, please.
And I'll add, Nick, I think sometimes just in our general practice too, you'll try to pull a transcript and it'll say it's not available, which sometimes can mean just that the IRS doesn't have that information on file for that year. But I've noticed that in rare instances, it can just be an issue with TDS at that moment in time. So sometimes it might be worth going back in on another day just to make sure that that information that you're seeking really is not available. All right, yes. Slide 12.
Thank you. Yep. Actually, slide 13, please. This is moving to wage and... Wait, no, I'm sorry.
IRS account transcripts, right?
Well, I think we're done with this, please.
Okay. 13.
Wage and income transcripts. So this is data from filed information returns, such as Form W-2, Forms 1099 series, including 1099 NEC, 1099 INT. It shows a lot, but not all data from information returns. So, for example, it's not going to show state tax withholdings. It's available usually for current and 9 prior taxable years. So right now, for example, could generally get them for 2014 through 2023 tax years. It's really useful, among other things, to prepare and file tax return if one is needed to claim the 2021 tax year recovery rebate credit, or RRC, on the 2021 Form 1040. For tax return preparation, that does require an unmasked transcript, which is essentially just unredacted. And so if that's not available on transcript delivery service through your own account and you're calling in the IRS to get it, you'll just want to let them know, hey, I need an unmasked wage and income transcript to prepare and file a tax return for taxpayer, because that is one of the situations when they're allowed to share that unmasked transcript. It's also good to help spot possible income-related identity theft. If it shows, a certain amount of money being sent to an address where someone has never lived or received mail from a payor they've never heard of, then it's a good yellow or red flag to look into that a bit more.
And we get into this a little later, especially with the inmate population. We've noticed a lot of unemployment compensation related identity theft, where someone who's been incarcerated 20 years is all of a sudden getting, being reported unemployment compensation under their social security number for 2020 or 2021. So that would definitely be a red flag. Or someone who was incarcerated for the year that you got the the wage and income transcript for, and it's showing that they had a W-2 or were working, at different locations. That should also be a red flag. And it is something that we see a bit more with the inmate population. They're a bit more susceptible to identity theft.
Thank you.
Next.
Yes, please. So this talks then about tax return transcript. Generally, it's available for the 3 most recently closed taxable years. Your mileage may vary in terms of which years are available at any given time. And this shows data from a recently filed return. It shows a lot of data, but not everything. So for example, it won't show, next slide, please, actually. This is a good segue into FOIA requests. So this is a way to get some information that's not in transcripts. So the transcripts aren't going to show, hey, this was a tax return claiming a refund. It was paid to a checking account with this routing number and account number. So FOIA might be a way to look for those records. Also, it's a way to get copies of letters and notices sent to the taxpayer, history details, all sorts of things that might be in the administrative file. IRS may claim some exclusions from FOIA if, for example, it's available from, another method. Let's see, this then lists different ways to make a FOIA request. And
the online portal is definitely really easy. I was surprised by how easy it is. I was someone who liked to type it out and submit the letter, but now that I've done it online, I don't want to do it any other way because it is quite easy to do it after you've done it the first time. And I found that my internet even saves the boxes, so I can double click and it'll pre-fill a lot of the boxes for me.
Yes, I totally agree. So that's the end of slide 15 here. So I'll pass it along. Thank you. All
right, thank you, Nick. So I'll take it up from here. Okay, so now that you've called into the IRS and you've secured your transcripts, you'll encounter generally about 4 scenarios. And the first is that the transcripts reflect that was no tax return filed. And as mentioned before, this could mean a lot of things. It could mean an error. It could mean that there was an identity verification hold placed on the account, which I'll get to in a bit. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to verify if there was a non-filing of the tax return to begin with, or if it was one of those other issues at hand. Do you mind going back to the slide there, Nancy?
I am trying.
If not, I can just basically say
the poll messed me up. Sorry, just
okay.
Here we go.
You can obviously call into the practitioner priority service support line and basically explain that the account says that there's no tax return filed, and ask them if that's right, or ask them if there is indeed an identity verification hold on the account. In my experience, it's actually kind of a coin toss if the agent would actually say if there's identity verification hold. So I've actually had to call maybe twice to sort of get that information. So it is important to just sort of make sure that that's the case. But we'll get to this later, that there's other avenues that you have in your toolkit instead of calling the IRS over and over again. And then also, if your client did indeed not file a tax return to get their 2021 credit, they can still do that by April 15th to get their 2021 rebate. We can go to the next slide.
Sure, and I think that just emphasizes the time sensitivity of this project, especially as it comes to the stimulus payments. The third stimulus payment was $1,400, which you know is a significant amount, especially for someone who's incarcerated. So if they haven't claimed it, and believe it or not, there are still many people that haven't claimed it, many inmates that haven't claimed their stimulus or thought they claimed it on their return but failed to fill it out properly. You know, they would still have time to do so, and getting help to do that is going to be really important.
Right. So scenario 2 is if there's identity verification hold. And again, in my experience, the agents, they haven't had a lot of experience with this. And if they have, it's with persons who aren't incarcerated. So if your client does have an identity verification hold, the agent, more likely than not, if they are going to give you instructions or sort of guidance on this, they're going to give you guidance for people that aren't incarcerated, right? So they're going to say your client can have an in-person visit, they can call with their papers in hand. All these options aren't necessarily available to us. But here's some things that are probably going to happen for your client, even if they are incarcerated. So when an identity verification hold is placed on the account, the IRS sends out a 488.3C letter. And that usually is sent out when the verification hold is put on the account. I have seen for my clients, it's sent out like multiple times. And you can request that they send it out again when you call. But it is sent out to the address of record on the account. And it really depends on when the return was filed. We can probably go to the next slide. Yes, so if your client did receive the 488.3C letter, which some of your clients have because they either their address of record they have access to, or they updated their address of record to the facility that they are as they're incarcerated. You can simply just ask your client to submit the letter to the prison official because there is a special avenue for incarcerated persons to verify their identity with the IRS through their prisons. And they can submit a form through their housing unit request, just as they would submit any other request. And they would just simply ask to get help verifying their identity with the IRS. And they can submit a copy of the letter or the letter itself. But if your client does not have access to the letter, which is probably going to happen to a lot of your clients, you can contact an LITC that has an identity verification pilot program, and they can help you verify your client's identity. And Nancy, I think you can speak more about the pilot program.
Yes. So if you are not enrolled yet, please reach out. We can give you information on how to get enrolled, but it's a special program for LITCs, low-income taxpayer clinics, to coordinate with the IRS on identity verification of your taxpayer and their return in question. So if you're not familiar with the issue, the identity verification hold prevents the return from processing, and it prevents the refund from being released. So if you're able to successfully verify your client's identity and the information from the return, then the IRS should go ahead and forward the return for processing. Now, that doesn't mean that the return wouldn't get selected for something else. If there is an issue on the return, other filters could still apply to the return where the IRS might question other things. However, it would at least move on to processing once you're able to get that verification hold off of the account. So the pilot program, basically the process involved is you would obtain the information from the return, things like the taxpayer's name, social security number, federal adjusted gross income, refund claimed, and then they ask some questions about whether the address has changed from the time the return was filed, which is nice because they also provide you with an opportunity to provide a change of address form. So once the spreadsheet is filled out, you email it to a specific email address. You do have to be enrolled in the program first because they also provide you with a special password to, protect the spreadsheet and the address change form before you send it off to the ID Verify program. But then they will select it, and I believe on Monday is the day that they try to work these cases in the order they receive them and go in and try to release, if they're satisfied that the information you're providing matches what they have on file, they'll go ahead and pass it through the identity verification onto the next step with the return processing. So I've used this process a lot, and I've had a lot of returns that we've been able to verify through the pilot program where the refund was released. There have been some situations, though, where I've checked the account transcript or called the IRS to follow up and find out, okay, I submitted this to the identity verification pilot program several weeks ago. I haven't received any updates or notices from the IRS. I'm going to check and see if the refund's been issued. And if it hasn't been issued, I've sent follow-up emails to the pilot program email address to say, hi, just spoke with the IRS today. It says there's still an identity verification hold. Can you provide an update? And usually I will get a response. And sometimes the response is, there's another issue they're working out. Sometimes the response is, yep, we've got it. They should be getting the refund in the next 4 to 6 weeks. But usually you do get some sort of response if you're able to follow up and say, I've submitted this and I'm still waiting to get the refund issued. So that can be super helpful if your inmate doesn't have the 4883C letter, or if the address on the IRS account is not their current address. So if you were to get the letter reissued, it wouldn't get sent to them. And unfortunately, as powers of attorney, we don't get copied on those notices. So even if you are on POA and they send the identity verification letter, it doesn't get sent to the POA. It only gets sent to the taxpayer. I think the main information they're really worried about is the control number. So that's one of the important pieces of information that's in that notice that the IRS uses, I think, to match, the account with the return.
Right. Thank you, Nancy. And in my experience, a decent amount of my clients have had access to that letter, and they only really needed to provide their name and the letter. And the operations managers of each of the facilities was able to, they have a special email that they just email to the IRS. I think they add in an Excel spreadsheet, and with those two pieces of information, they're able to lift the identity verification hold. But as Nancy said, and I'm sure a lot of you have already experienced, your clients don't have access to that letter. So this pilot program is a really great avenue that we have to bypass the usual route, which our clients can't use anyway.
And Diggy, we got a question in the chat from Lee Moore, who I know is working a lot of these cases at an LATC, saying that they just received IRS letter 6167C telling them the verification documents they provided are not sufficient and that the inmate needs to make an appointment at a taxpayer assistance center to walk in and verify the identity. I don't know, have you had that issue come up or any suggestions on what they could do in that situation?
Yeah, so I haven't. And so my question to Lee Moore would be if your client has access to the letter or not. I'm going to assume that your client doesn't. I know that for one of the agents, and I wish I had pulled up my notes for this, one of the agents did tell me that they do, if you do speak to, I think, hold on one second. Let me see if I can pull up my notes. But I do know that there might be another avenue for incarcerated persons that's contacting that prison official unique method, but I haven't used that either. So I don't have any experience with that.
They must have some conflicting information or something that's maybe preventing it from going through smoothly.
Right. But I just, yeah, our clients walking in to an appointment, we can't do that. So
Not an
yeah,
option.
yeah, those
Yeah, and Lee
instructions are
said,
helpful.
it sounds like Lee, you submitted a 911 to Taz, I'm guessing, and that you submitted the 4883C letter with that. I would
Oh,
guess
okay.
that under normal circumstances, that would be sufficient, but so maybe there's something else going on.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, so Lee, I would say, how about you call the facility that your client is at and ask to speak to someone who verifies inmates' identities with the IRS, because that's what I did. And I spoke with the person, and that's how I spoke with multiple people. And that's how I found the information that I found out about this.
How did you get the number or how did you figure out who you needed to talk to?
I just called the main line and I asked verbatim, can I speak to the person who verifies inmates' identity with the IRS? And they linked
That's
me to
great.
an operations manager. Yes,
There's no like secret word or anything.
no, I mean, I was put on hold a few times. I will say
Yeah.
that, but so I do recommend that you do that. I will try that again. Have not had much success in the past. Yeah, I know it can be a lot, but
Let
that
me
it works
just
for me.
add here also that if you haven't already, what can be very useful is the Internal Revenue Manual, IRM. Most of it is available online. So, for example, IRM 25.25.6 talks about the Taxpayer Protection Program, and this is for them to meet their FOIA obligations. So, for example, I'm not sure about the letters 6167 capital C, but I had a situation where IRS had allegedly sent a letter 4883 capital C, and I was able to, on my client's behalf, go to attack and bring a copy of the filed return, along with all of the schedules, forms, wage and income transcript, or information returns with it, along with my, valid form of photo identification. The tax assister wanted a second form of identification, which was a bit of a hassle, and not in the usual IRM in terms of requirements for a TAC appointment. I don't know if it works for all letters, but at least for some of them, it's worth considering and researching whether you as representative might be able to do the TAC appointment for your client.
Great. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you for that, Nick. You can probably go to the next slide then. We covered this. This is just what the letter 4883C looks like. And the control number, which we redacted here, that's just the information that we need. So even if your client, let's say they don't have this letter, but for some reason they know the control number, we can just submit that information. We can go to the next slide.
Before we do, we have another question in the chat. Sarah Laura asking about, and I've experienced this issue too. What do you do if your client doesn't have a copy of the return, doesn't remember anything about the return, and now we're out of statute to file a 2020 return, and then for them to be eligible for the credit? I have done my best guess. And what I think that the inmate probably filed, I think that's sort of your last hope to try to get the stimulus for them. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it. So I think, and I know others do this too, the data filing, yes, that can be tricky as well. That's where maybe you are trying to ask the taxpayer if they have an idea when they filed it. And I find that they usually do. And the question was, for those of you that didn't see the chat, what about the data filing? So that's one of the questions on the spreadsheet when you're submitting it to the pilot program. I find that the inmate might have a general idea when they filed the return, if they filed a return. So I think you can try to estimate, approximately when you think the return was filed, and hopefully if it's close enough, that'll get you through.
And if the taxpayer did file the return, might consider whether it's worth filing a Form 4506 along with a $30 fee. I've heard that when it's paper filed, that sometimes it will have a copy of the postmark. If they, that is a situation where if you do a FOIA request, the IRS will reject it based on a purported exclusion under routine agency procedures. So it's their position at least.
Yes, so thank you, Nick, for mentioning that. And that was something I wasn't aware of, but it's not the usual 4506. Is it the 4506F, not the T? But there's a special form to request. But that might be when you suspect identity theft. That's right. But there are the 4506, different series is there that you might be able to request a copy of the return, but obviously there is a cost involved. So, in a lot of situations I find with our clients, they may not have the money to do that.
And just wanted to reiterate that when the identity verification holds happen, that the IRS agents, they may send you blank transcripts, put you on a long hold. I always get the please hold while I investigate. And I have to say, no. I already know what you're trying to investigate. There's an identity verification hold, is there not? And they say yes. And I say, okay, good day. Thank you very much. I've already been on hold for 3 hours. Thank you. But like we said, you genuinely, you have two very good options. If your client has a letter, just go ahead and submit that letter. And if your client doesn't, contact an LITC. And I'm not going to say ignore what the IRS agent tells you, but if they give you instructions for walking into an appointment or calling, again, that's not generally helpful for our clients. Go to the next slide. Okay. So if when you're on the phone and you're asking for some information, what I've noticed is that they can't tell you that the address that the letter was sent, because usually since the prison official avenue, it's been so easy and requires the least amount of information. I try to at least get the letter reissued. Because a lot of my clients, they still have access to the address on file because they'll use a family member's address or whatever the case may be. But they can't tell us the address on file. But they can say the date that the letter was issued, and also the year that the identity verification hold applies, which is helpful for you in your investigation on any identity theft related issues, just in general. So that's also helpful. And like I said before, you can request that the IRS agent reissue the letter. But if your client doesn't necessarily have access to this address, you don't know the address, this is probably not going to be applicable for you. This is probably going to only really affect a limited number of clients, but in my experience, it's still been quite helpful.
That's a good point, Diggy, because there might be an address on the account that could be related to the taxpayer, but you don't know. So, right, you don't want them to resend it. So that could be something maybe to try to find out ahead of time when you're doing that initial intake from the taxpayer. I know our sample questionnaire, I think, asks for your prior address, but it might be good just to ask for not only prior address, but maybe addresses that may have been used on prior filed returns, so you can know if it's a legitimate address or not. Because if it is an identity thief, obviously you don't want to be sending the identity verification letter to them.
Yes, so that's what we've asked. We've asked for prior addresses and any addresses that they have submitted to the IRS, just in general, and also family members who've lived at those addresses as well. just to sort of get an indication, just an idea as to what's going on. And usually, when our clients write to us, they're proactively providing us information for family members anyway, and that information anyway. So we're able to sort of gauge, okay, which clients should be asked this information and which we shouldn't. And I think so for this next scenario, I'm going to pass it off to Nancy to talk about when the credit was issued, but your client didn't receive the payment.
Okay, so we have this in a good number of our cases where the taxpayer says, I didn't get the, stimulus, but when you get the account transcripts or you call the IRS, you find out that one or more of the stimulus payments was actually issued. And then you just know, okay, the taxpayer didn't receive it. So what is the next step? And I just want to mention, this is what I found so hard at first about working these cases, is that for a lot of the things we do with the IRS, there's already this process that we know we need to do, right? You want to do an offer in compromise, you fill out the forms, you gather the documents, you submit it. With these cases, because this is a brand new issue, the stimulus payments, this is the first time in I don't know how long that stimulus payments have been issued. We're all kind of learning as we go. So I think that's where it's really important that as a tax community, we're sharing information with each other so that we can help each other work these cases, because we are learning a lot as we go, and we can do a lot of great things through that, but sometimes it takes, trial and error. So, requesting the refund trace, I think, is the next step once you know that a payment's been issued and that the taxpayer didn't receive it. If the payment was issued within the past year from when you're calling the IRS, they can actually do it through a verbal request with you over the phone as POA. But if the payment was issued over a year ago, then you do need to submit Form 3911. Or I think that inmates have been successful in just writing a letter and saying they want to find out what happened to their payment trace. But as practitioners, submitting a 3911 is the way to go. And one of the interesting things that I learned when we were preparing for this presentation with Cecilia Hernandez, who it appears will not be able to make it for the presentation, and I extend my apologies about that. But one of the things that she told us is that any additional information you can provide with your payment trace request is going to be helpful. And that was news to me, because we have all sorts of information, but, I was just sort of following the form and filling it out the way it asked us to. But she said it would actually be helpful if you attached a statement, if you wrote in a note at the bottom, which I think is what, maybe some of the inmates do, explaining the situation, what you think happened, that they were incarcerated and that, they suspect someone else filed the return, or they suspect, the check was sent to the prison, but never made it into the inmate's account. So that's going to be helpful to the IRS when they're investigating these issues. So here is a sample of a 3911. And in red is the information you want to make sure that you're entering on the form: name, social security number, address, current address, because that's where any follow-up is going to be sent to the taxpayer, and the tax year in question. And then towards the bottom of the form, in this example, we're using the example of someone who's been issued the stimulus payment in advance as an EIP. So that's why we checked the box individual, but as well as other, and we wrote EIP. If you're requesting a refund trace, from a tax return, maybe you'd put RRC there. But you're always including the refund amount, the tax period that you're requesting the trace for, and then the date that either the return was filed or the stimulus was issued in advance as the EIP. And you're going to want to do that for each payment. So definitely do one form for each payment, even though there might have been two payments that went out for 2020. You want to have one for each one. And then again, it does need to be signed by the taxpayer, so you can fill it out and mail it to them, but they will need to sign it and send it back before you can submit it to the IRS. And generally you're submitting it to the IRS by fax. There's actually several different fax numbers that the IRS is using to receive 3911s. I found that the number for the area that I'm supposed to use is always busy and my faxes never go through. So I have used other numbers that are not specific to Virginia, and the refund trace requests have gone through and been processed. So just to let you know, if you keep hitting a busy signal, you can maybe try a different fax number, because there are several, and you can find that either on the instructions, but I believe I found those on the IRS website related to refund traces.
I've done that as well, Nancy. I wasn't going to say that if Celia was here, but I've done that as well.
I know Cecilia's not here, so we can say something. But it does get processed, and it can take several weeks if you're wondering about, like, well, what's the processing time of some of these? It might take a few weeks. You might get a letter from the IRS in response, but generally, and this slide goes through the process. First off, if the payment was not cashed, the original payment is supposed to be canceled, and then the new payment will be issued. So, for example, if the original payment was a check and the check was never cashed, or the original payment was direct deposit, but maybe the bank rejected it, it's possible that by filing, or what should happen by filing the refund trace, is that the original form of payment would be canceled, and then they would issue a new payment to the taxpayer. If the payment was cashed, that's where the Bureau of Fiscal Service is supposed to step in and investigate. But what we also learned from Cecilia is they're limited to sort of a 1-year period. So if the payment has been issued to the taxpayer less than 1 year ago, Bureau of Fiscal Service will be responsible for investigating that issue and following it through to the end. However, if the payment was issued more than a year ago, Bureau of Fiscal Service actually will not be involved in the investigation of the issue. And that's where IRS is actually supposed to follow up. And I told Cecilia, I said, I don't think I've had IRS follow up on any of mine. You know, we've gotten letters saying, oh, the payment was issued on this date to this bank account with this account number. And in most cases with my clients, that's not an account they have access to. But then I've gotten no further correspondence from the IRS. So what she said was that we should be responding and submitting a letter saying, I didn't receive this, you know, I would like this investigated. I want the IRS to look into this because I didn't receive this money. And the IRS is supposed to look into these cases. So all to say, if you're outside of the 1 year, all hope is not lost. But I think it does get a little more difficult because you're working with the IRS and asking them to investigate the issue. If it is within 1 year, Bureau of Fiscal Service will look into it. They'll send your client a package, and it's supposed to include copies of the front and back of the check, or information regarding a direct debit. So things like the bank account number, the bank, the routing number, the date of the payment, the amount of the payment. It'll also indicate whether the funds are still there or not. And we have some slides with examples coming up. Now, that's really helpful if your inmate actually gets the package. Unfortunately, for a lot of mine, for whatever reason, they didn't get the package. But that's a really good place to start. If you can see copies of the check, you can see who signed it. Is it someone you know? Is it someone you suspect had stolen the check or stolen the refund? And then go from there. So within 1 year, your client can fill out form 1133, FS form 1133, which is one of the forms that Bureau of Fiscal Service is supposed to send. That's considered the claim form if you hear it referenced in IRS notices. So now we'll get into some examples, including the 1133, so you can see what that looks like. But this is the result of a refund trace request. The response having to do with Comerica Bank, you'll see here. And it includes things like the trace number, the account number, the type of payment, the amount of the payment, when it was credited to the account, if it's still available. here's an example of a refund trace check. And on to the right of this slide, you'll see examples of what's been on the back of these checks. So for one, we were able to see that it was deposited into the inmate's account at the Department of Corrections. The second one was someone who went rogue and somehow got my client's stimulus payment, and now we're trying to figure out, what to do from here, report it as identity theft and go through that process. But I think the checks can be really helpful. Number one, because you can see what address the check was sent to, which of course is blacked out here to protect my client's confidentiality. But number two, you can see information like where it was cashed, who signed it, if it looks like your client's signature, if it looks like it was forged. We have definitely seen a lot of that. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what do you do if the Bureau of Fiscal Service releases the information to your taxpayer? They send the copies of the check, they send the claim form, but your client doesn't receive it. And I was really stumped with that. I had taken several different measures to try to get that information. I had gotten certified letters, not certified, I'd gotten affidavits from my inmates, including all of the information, telling BFS to send the information to me. I'd submitted that to BFS. I'd tried calling, I'd tried emailing and providing that information, and I never got a response. And then Nick, thank you so much, Nick, let me know, hey, I found that you can use this form, FS Form 13, to get information from Bureau of Fiscal Service. And so I have just been going crazy submitting these to BFS because I've had a lot of clients that we've done payment traces for, and then I never got any of the information because we don't get copied on it as POAs. So apologies to Cynthia Sidner-Jones, who I think is the disclosure officer, because I think she might be getting a lot more requests now that you guys are getting up to speed on this too. But it's a form that you fill out the inmate's information on the top, and then they would sign it. And then the second part, I'm not sure if we have it here. No, the second part of the form just asks for the authorized representative's information. The inmate signs it. And you can submit the form via fax to BFS. I've got the fax number here, but it's also on the form itself. But also, thank you again, Nick, you can use the form in the FOIA online system to request, to make a FOIA request. And so that's how I'm doing getting all of my Bureau of Fiscal Service information, the claims packages or just information about the payments that were issued, is by using this process. So you'll see Cynthia Sidner-Jones listed as a contact there as a co-disclosure officer. But basically you're filling out your information, you're attaching the signed FS Form 13, and then you're making your request. I'm happy to save a sample of what I've been using I basically just use the same language each time I'm doing it, requesting things related to the 2020 and 2021 stimulus payments, forms 1133 or 13818, which is limited payability of a claim against the US government. And usually within 1 to 2 weeks, I'm getting a response, and it's usually electronic. So I'll either get an email response, or I will get an email link to to enter like a secure messaging portal to obtain the information that way. But it's been really helpful to get the copies of the checks, to get the claim forms that way. And through this process is also how I've learned that if it's been more than 1 year since the payment was issued, when you submit your refund trace request, Bureau of Fiscal Service will not issue you a claim form because Bureau of Fiscal Service will not be investigating it. So I had been hitting a wall with that too, because I was like, well, why am I getting the claim form with some of these? Why am I not getting the claim form with all of these if I've submitted a payment trace request in all of these and I'm seeing the checks and I'm seeing everything else? And so credit to Cynthia that she shared that information with me, that it has to have been, the payment has to have been issued within the past year. So you might have one payment that falls within that parameter, and you might have another payment that has been issued over a year ago, and then you're going to have to work that issue through the IRS. But you'll see on the right side of the form, that's sort of the beginning of the information that they request through the FOIA portal. But it's really easy to do. It takes just a few minutes, and we'll share the sample information on the ABA Inmate Tax Assistance page.
And also the FOIA responses I've gotten from BFS will explain that, I'll just read from it, quote, "The reporting and reconciliation branch of the Fiscal Service searched its records in the Treasury Receivable Accounting and Collection System, TRACS, and its Treasury Check Information System, TCIS, and identified ... unquote." So they've got their own program, and then it's got within it several different tabs. And so I've gotten either a printout of information from a tab or a copy of the deposited check. And also for some of the checks that are deposited for Virginia inmates, it'll show, or I've seen times where it shows two electronic endorsements. The first one, BOFD, which I guess is Bank of First Deposit, and then a second one a few days later, possibly, because it kind of seems like first the money is transferred into the facility's account, and then it's transferred over to the inmate's individual client trust account.
Well, I'll share a horror story about that. Not so much about BFS, but what we were able to figure out by getting that BFS information was that we had worked really hard to finally get the taxpayer's identity verified, get the tax return processed, and get the refund issued, and then make sure that the IRS had the right address because the taxpayer had been relocated to a different prison. Which I'm hoping other states have what Virginia has. They have a Virginia Department of Corrections website where you can do what they call an inmate lookup. And you can either put their first and last name in, and they'll tell you their inmate number and what facility that they're currently located in. And it's very, very up-to-date information. So you can check like same day to see, okay, are they still at that address or have they been relocated? Because hopefully they're writing to you to let you know, but they may not. So it's really helpful to have that. And I imagine other states would have that as well. But we get the check issued. I'm talking to IRS. They're saying, okay, the refund's going out. Here's the amount. I'm writing to my inmate saying, okay, great news. Your refund is finally coming to you. There might be some delay. Check with the business office at your prison to find out if it's been issued. Never shows up. Couple months go by. Never shows up. And I said, well, we've had some inmates where it's just taken a while to get into the account. As you may have learned from the last training, there are situations where the IRS will send the payment. The prison will send the payment back to the IRS to have it verified as being authentic, and then sent back to the prison to be deposited into the inmate account. And I haven't really seen any rhyme or reason. It doesn't seem like all facilities do it. So I said, okay, maybe it's something like that. Well, we find out through a payment trace that the refund was issued, and it was issued to the prison address. And we see the back of the check, and there's just some random signature on it. So at some point between the check being released from the IRS to the Postal Service to getting to the facility, someone grabbed that check. Because if the facility had received it and deposited it into the account, there would have been that stamp like you saw on a prior slide. So with that particular inmate, we got the claim form because the payment had been issued within the past year. And he filled it out. And I asked him to send it to me just so I can make sure before we submit it that it accurately reflected the situation. And then I submitted it to Bureau of Fiscal Service, and it's now being investigated. But that's just one example of, I was not expecting that whatsoever. So I think in tax, we kind of learn to expect anything, right? Like sometimes it's just really not what you think it's going to be. And that's what happened in this situation. But we've had others, even non-inmates, where we've used the trace to figure out farm workers that we're working with, that the foreman was stealing the checks the stimulus checks when they were coming in and forging signatures on it. And then another person was depositing it into their account. So you get a lot of interesting information through these traces and the FOIA requests. Now, this is just some information from the Form FS 1133 that we've been talking about, the claim form that you'd be submitting. They interestingly ask you not to fold the document. I don't know if I have an example of that here, but it says do not fold. So you want to keep it flat. They ask you to fill out the claim form in black ink and to answer all questions on both pages if you're saying you didn't sign the check or give someone else permission to sign the check. But these are the types of questions they're asking. Did you receive the check? Did you sign your name? Did you cash the check? Did you deposit it? If you have information concerning the cashing of the check, and you can provide it. So they ask a lot of information trying to get at what exactly happened. But I think, judging from what Cecilia was saying about the payment trace requests and adding additional information, it would probably be pretty helpful to add additional information to the form, or to the FS form 1133. And so I think it is helpful if I've had clients that got the form and filled it out and sent it, and now I don't have a copy and I'm trying to get it through FOIA, through BFS. But I think if you know that it's coming and you can give them a pre-addressed stamped envelope, or they have the ability to mail it to you, that you have a look at it before submitting it, just to make sure that it's like coherent and it makes sense the way that they've laid out the issue, because potentially you could attach a statement with further explanation of what you suspect actually happened. Okay, and I thought we had a couple questions here. It's not pulling up for me. Jack, if there's questions,
Sure.
feel free to jump in.
So Rianka noted that refund traces can look different when her clinic gets refund traces. They're on normal IRS letterhead in letter format, which is helpful to know. And then also Nicole Choi said that she was told they could not use Form 3911 if no tax return was filed, but the EIP was issued. They were told that they would need to first file the return and then do a refund trace. Is that not the case? Can you submit a Form 3911 when no return was filed?
Yes, you can absolutely file the 3911 when no return was filed, because you're requesting a trace of the payment from the IRS. And it's such a unique situation. I understand why maybe, I don't know if the representative you were speaking with was confused, because this really doesn't happen, that a payment, aside from maybe the 2021, the child, advanced child tax credit payments, but the stimulus payments being issued in advance and not claimed on the return, it's such a unique situation. But I have successfully filed many, many of these. And then usually I'm indicating either on the top or in that box that I showed you on a prior slide that it's the EIP. So that tells them it was issued in advance of a return being filed. And if you can get the account transcript that shows when the payment went out and you use that as the date that it was filed, I've had no issues with getting the trace processed. So I'm sorry that happened, because I'm sure that caused issues for you as you're trying to work these. And that's where I think what Diggy said really rings true, is trying to, if possible, because I know we don't all have forever to wait on the hold with IRS, but if it's possible to get a second opinion from someone, because sometimes you will get different answers from different representatives. And I think especially now with us having new representatives that are being trained as IRS expands its workforce, they're not totally up to speed yet. And you can usually tell within the first, few minutes of the call if it's someone that has been doing this a while and really knows what they're talking about, or if it's someone that has to check everything. And that might be a tip to you, that maybe try calling back another time, or double checking the information that you're being given.
Also, as an
Yeah, and
option,
that's
maybe. Sorry,
go ahead,
Lynn.
Nick.
An option maybe to consider. A lot of people are new. This stuff changes all the time. Like, I just was looking at the IRM section for TPP, and a manual transmittal has like 100 and something significant changes to it. So stuff can be moving all the time. But if the frontline representative is telling you something that is incorrect or that seems incorrect, maybe asking to speak with their manager is something to consider as well.
Yeah, and to add on to that and to respond to what Nancy was saying, it's a through line, right? These stimulus payments, it was the first time that this has ever happened. Then add on top of that the incarcerated population. It's difficult for them to receive help, and a lot of people didn't even know that they even qualified for these payments in the first place. So we're at a unique intersection where even the IRS agents, they're not even fully knowledgeable that these sort of issues are even happening. And again, this relates back to Lee Moore's question, and again, it perfectly ties into Nick's advice. It's call and ask to speak to a manager, whether it's calling into the facility and just sort of saying, hey, like my client needs to verify their identity, or calling into the IRS and just saying, hey, actually, can I speak to a manager to just sort of clarify what's happening, because this work, it's very, very unique. Yeah.
Also, there's just a comment from Sarah Laura. Don't forget to get the return in, need the return in to claim it. Because I think also a year and change ago, I mean, it was a great lesson to me because I'd follow the news about after the IRS had made up this IRC provision to exclude inmates from eligibility. I thought that's a great outcome that that's been resolved. And I thought the issue would have fixed itself. Well, no, if there had been no EIP 1, 2, or 3, it was on the inmate to have to file a tax return. And it's not like there is each year a VITA site in each facility. So there are a lot of gaps here that could use a lot of assistance.
Yes, and a lot of information and misinformation, even among the incarcerated population. And a lot of my clients, they'll tell me, oh, I heard from so and so that I should have done such and such. And that could have ranged from file, in which case, thank you, such and such, for telling, this, all the way to, oh, I didn't file because of this. And I think, oh, no, darn it, So yeah, so Nick, I entirely agree.
And I just was reminded that, because I think that relates to the inmate sort of scuttlebutt. We've had some clients that thought all of their EIPs would be protected even from child support offsets. But especially the first stimulus payment was subject to child support offsets. So we had some inmates writing to us, like citing laws and things, saying, I thought this was protected, or I heard from so-and-so that this was protected. But that's also something to keep an eye out for. And usually you see that on the account transcript, is if the payment or a portion of the payment was offset to non-IRS debt. That can be anything from an outstanding child support liability to student loans to medical debt. I had one that was offset to medical debt. So that is possible. And in that situation, usually we're advising the inmate we can't assist with that, but that they would need to contact the agency to which the offset was paid to try to resolve any outstanding issues there.
And another issue that I just recently discovered was a refund anticipation loan for one of my clients. We received a letter from the IRS saying that their refund was sort of taken to repay that. And I'm not sure that he knew that happened, or maybe he did. He didn't tell me, but I'll figure that out soon. But also just to make sure that we're on time and to address the scenario 4, which I think sort of encapsulates a lot of the different themes that we've been talking about related to identity theft that we've been touching upon throughout this conversation. It's a lot of your clients, there probably will have an inkling if they've been the victim of some tax related identity theft. And there are going to be some that really don't have a clue and that just want to make sure that they get the refund that they qualify for. So it's going to be up to you to look at the transcripts through all the years and at least on the Morgan Lewis side, we've been pulling the transcripts for 2019 as well, just to make sure and see, and 2018, and looking at the wage and income transcripts too. And also looking at when our clients were incarcerated, because if they've been incarcerated for a very long time and we see that they were working in certain years, then we know that something, some red flags are there. And we can go to the next slide.
And we should mention
Okay.
Diggy. Diggy, we're fortunate that Diggy was able to put together this sort of flow chart, and we'll also be sharing that shows sort of the life of one of these cases and the different turns that it can take. But that's what you're seeing here is these excerpts from what Diggy put together.
Yes. Yes, and also when you're delving into these cases, you know, you're playing the part of detective, and you're trying to figure out, you know, whether, you know, someone else filed the tax return and got these, or, you know, your client actually did file the return and someone else just took the check, like Nancy's worst case scenario. Or sometimes, and this has happened for some of our clients, they've actually collaborated with their friends and family. And you know, the getaway driver actually drove off without them, so to speak. And they have to figure that out amongst themselves. And that's actually happened with a few of our clients. And we've actually been able to like sort of figure that out and make it right among family members. And then also another complication are the unemployment benefit fraud side of things. And I know, Nancy, you want to touch upon that. But before we get there, I would just want to say that all of these sort of like identity theft scenarios can happen to your clients in multiple ways, because we are potentially dealing with 3 different refund checks, right? So your client could have been hit 3 different ways, unfortunately. So it just really sort of depends. And that's why you want to do your due diligence and sort of check and read their story and sort of speak to your client, and just make sure that everything is in order and you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's.
Yeah, so on the unemployment benefits front, we've had several that have been incarcerated for a while, and then all of a sudden on the W-2, on the wage and income transcripts, I'm seeing unemployment compensation benefits being issued to them. And I'm not sure if this is normal, but a lot of times their last name was listed as their first name and their first name was listed as their last name, which I don't recall from my clients that are not, you know, inmates or victims of identity theft. So what we did is we prepared a standard letter. We had one for Virginia and one for North Carolina, because those were the 2 states. And I think one's for Pennsylvania, maybe, because those were the states that we saw this happening with, where we filled it out and said, you know, and then had the client sign it and send it back to us. And then we mailed it to either the Virginia Employment Commission, then, you know, North Carolina Employment Commission, just to let them know so they're aware of this, you know, potential theft. Obviously, checking with the inmate first to make sure, is this, you know, is this accurate? Did you receive these funds? Do you know what this could be? And then if they agreed, no, that's fraud, that's identity theft. We've just been doing this 1-pager that we fill their information out on the page, and then they can sign it, and we'll send it to the Employment Commission just to report that potential fraud, because it could have an impact on their tax case too, right? Because when the IRS gets their tax return and they're looking, okay, they reported 0 income, yet on the wage and income transcript, it shows $16,000 of unemployment compensation, that might trigger an audit or an underreporter review. So I think it's good to have that, both to put the Employment Commission on notice, but also because it could have an impact on your tax case.
Yeah, also, yeah, and your client, a lot of times they may have no way of knowing that this is happening. For one of my clients, you know, he's been incarcerated since he was a child, and any sort of questions that we ask him about, you know, where were you living prior to this? He says, I don't know, you know, because he was incarcerated since he was a child. He doesn't remember where he lived when he was 13 before he was incarcerated. He's been incarcerated ever since. And it's really gratifying to sort of like help him but it's also really sad and frustrating that he's being taken advantage of. And so it's nice that we're setting things right. And I know that there's a lot of waiting in these cases. And I know that many of you have experienced some frustration and headaches with the bureaucracy and all the procedural nuances. But at the end of the day, we are helping people that are not sympathetic in the normal sense and that are really getting taken advantage of. And we are doing good work helping these people at the end of the day.
Yes.
And yeah, I just wanted to also add to, just check in with your clients, ask them questions, learn their story, ask them what they did with their tax returns, if they worked with their family and friends about it, if they file it themselves, because some of them, they've done it when they're incarcerated themselves. What form of payment that they indicated, because I know, Nancy, that you had mentioned that for the prison system, they're supposed to send back the check to sort of verify with the IRS and then deposit it into their system. That's actually kind of confusing. I didn't know that before I started working on these cases. And I sort of thought, okay, that's very confusing. And if I were on the receiving end of that, I would be concerned. So just double check with your client. And I've also asked my clients to check into their trust accounts. Did you mysteriously get a bunch of money and you're not telling me? And some of them have actually sent me their trust account, information and sort of said, yeah, I'm not sure what this means. Could you let me know? And I've actually been able to confirm, actually, you did receive that here. And for some people, you didn't. And let's just see. I've noticed that with clients, they love to tell their story and they love to get to the bottom of things because they really don't know what's going on too. And so just double check with your client about their story when they're incarcerated and review their transcripts. I send my clients their transcripts. They like to review them too and ask some questions. And just continue to do good work.
And I mean, if there is a deadline, like they need to still file their 2021 Form 1040 to get a refund or something else that's urgent, of course, that's a priority, but also just seeing these as amazing educational opportunities because someone might be getting released in a week or a year or two and might not know about VITA, GCE sites, things like that. Or maybe for the first time in a long time or first time ever, they're going to deal with tax withholdings and the need to have those. So, as in a lot of cases, prevention is way better than trying to mitigate damages later on, to the extent you can put that in there as well. And then also just, memories can be fragile, right? So I'm guessing if we all, after this, go pull our 2014 and 2015 wage and income transcripts from the IRS, we might not remember, where we worked, let alone how much we got paid or what was withheld. So all good points, Tiggy. Thank you for covering those as well.
Right. Thank you, Nick. And also just want to touch upon the Form 14039, the identity theft affidavit with the IRS, that you can file this if you see identity theft sort of clues with your client. And it also, it's quite important, and we've mentioned this before, to include an explanation and also include that your client is indeed incarcerated. They've been incarcerated since X date, and go through the details about why you think that they're the victim of identity theft. And also include that this population is particularly vulnerable. I think that the more that the IRS is flagged about this issue, that the more efficient that they'll get with this issue. Or maybe I'm just being optimistic. And lastly, just to know that the IRS is generally taking at least 650 days to process these, and that's kind of frustrating. But we should still get those in. I know that there's a question in the chat.
And while you're,
go ahead.
I was just going to share a couple of practice tips related to the form while you're checking out the question box. Number one, if you've ever tried to use the form, the explanation section, for whatever reason, it never lines up. The words never quite line up with the lines. So I usually just say, please see attached, and then you can write as much as you want, just make sure you're putting the taxpayer's name and social security number and the form 14039 listed at the top so they know it's an attachment. But also sometimes when you call the IRS, you find that the IRS on its own has flagged the account for potential identity theft or for identity theft. In that situation, I always ask them when it was flagged and what years were marked. That way I know, okay, what's 650 days from that date? When can I expect information, or when can I follow up if we haven't heard anything? So that has been helpful in some situations if the IRS is doing it themselves. And then always knowing what years they're questioning, because as a reminder, some of these payments went out based on a 2018 or 2019 tax return. So the credit is being, or the stimulus is being issued in 2020 or 2021, but it's actually being based on a 2018 or 2019 tax return. So when you're filing your identity theft form, you're going to want to make sure you're including 2018 or 2019 if that's the year that you suspect a fraudulent return was filed. Then I guess you could also potentially include 2020 and 2021. I don't have specific guidance on whether it makes sense to do that or not, but maybe better safe than sorry, since those are the years the payments went out. But in my identity theft claim, I usually include, we would like the payments to be reissued to the taxpayer because they didn't receive them as a result of the identity theft.
We have what I think is going to be the last question. If you want me to read that out. Because cases are taking over 600 days to process currently, what is your advice for subsequent years when helping these populations? Do you go ahead and get an IP PIN for each subsequent year until the prior year's identity theft form is processed?
That's a really great question. Does anyone want to jump in first on that? I think the only caveat with the IP PIN program is that you get a new number each year mailed to you. So whatever the address on record is for your taxpayer. So for some situations that's fine. That's not going to hurt or harm them. But if they're moving around a lot, that can be problematic once they're released, or if they don't have access to their online account. So you can get a copy of your IP PIN online once you verify your identity through the IRS website. So that is another option if you are moving around a lot and maybe your letter gets mailed to an address that's not your current address. But I think that's just something to maybe inform the inmate about and let them decide. That's usually my approach with things like that. You know, we can do this, but here's maybe the downsides, but these are also the benefits. So I think maybe the benefit in that situation does outweigh any downsides, where if you suspect they could be a victim of identity theft again in the future for things like employment or unemployment compensation, then I think an IP PIN could be a really good solution. If you have any additional questions, I think we're happy to answer them. If you want to shoot us an email or contact one of the contacts on the Inmate Tax Assistance page, there should be contact information there. Please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to share some last remarks. So that's all the time we have for today's presentation. As a reminder, if you are seeking CLE credit for today's program, you will receive an email with a link to complete the certification process within 48 hours. Please follow the link and complete the affidavit, providing your bar information as requested. Once the completed form is submitted and your attendance has been verified, your certificate will be emailed to you. To our faculty for this program, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. On behalf of the ABA, I'm Nancy Rosner, and thank you for joining us.